Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation here in Oregon. And tonight we have a topic that's kind of dear to a lot of folks' heart, the return of the sea otter. The sea otters have been out of our sight here since the early 1800s, when Lewis and Clark tried to find them, wanted to buy some pelts to take back to show Thomas Jefferson. And of course, those were very valuable even then. And the beaver were more plentiful, so they got a lot of those. But the sea otter was highly prized in China. Tonight, we're lucky to have a speaker who's been looking at this topic for quite a while. She's on the board of Elaka Foundation.
Alliance.
Alliance, and the Oregon Coastal Alliance, which is another group that she associates with. But tonight, we're going to hear about the sea otter and the efforts to bring it back. And Cameron La Follette is our speaker. So I want to welcome her. There'll be time for questions later. As she presents tonight, you'll be following the history of this amazing story. And I think you'll have questions as well. So Cameron, take it over.
Okay. Welcome to everybody in the room and everybody not in the room, but online. I want to talk tonight about an animal we don't have anymore in Oregon, and that's the sea otter. Sea otters were exterminated in Oregon around 1910 as a result of many different kinds of things. And the question really has always been, how did it happen? We know in general how it happened with maritime fur trade and later fur traders and later hunting, but what actually happened? The history of Oregon sea otters and how they came to be no more on the coast has really never been told. So let's start with a little bit of information about this. This is a slide. It's traditional range. The yellow shows where they are currently found now, and the red shows where they aren't anymore, but they used to. And as you can see, that includes the entire coast of Oregon. So unlike fur seals, sea otters do not congregate in big populations on land, but they do have the richest and densest fur in the world, with more than 100,000 hairs per square inch. And they need that for insulation because they have no blubber. And these are cold northern waters. Larry was able to get a sea otter pelt from Fort Vancouver, and I encourage those in the room to come up and stroke it afterwards. You can get a sense of how rich and luxuriant the fur is and why it became such an important article of trade and purchase. So you can see from this slide that the original range of the sea otter went from Japan up through the Bering Sea area, Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California, and all the way down to Baja. Basically, it's a large northern marine mammal that lives mostly at sea. So if we're going to tell the story of the Oregon sea otter, we have to start with the native traditions, the tales, the reminiscences, and the archaeology. Thanks to Peter Hatch of the Siletz Nation for this slide. As you can see from this, all of the Oregon coastal tribes have a word for sea otter in their languages. And that is a really good indication that sea otters used to live all along the Oregon coast, because languages don't generally have words for things that they're not aware of. So that's one indication of how, not commonplace, but how known and how frequent and how extensive their habitat was in Oregon. A second way that we know is via archaeology from Middens. The heaps of leftovers and shells and bones near Native American settlements prior to contact with Europeans. Middens will tell us, and do tell us, that sea otters inhabited the entire Oregon coast, but Studies will not tell us the detailed populations or the exact locations. However, they do tell us that they're in native middens from Seaside in the north to south of Cape sea otter bones. The North Coast sites had more sea otter bones overall. South Coast sites had second largest amounts. The problem with midden studies is that middens have often been washed away by erosion. You know, the Pacific Ocean pounds our coast, as I'm sure you've all seen, or they have been destroyed in later settlement, or dikes, or jetties, or highways. And the other problem is the presence of sea otter bones in middens tells us that they were there, but it doesn't tell us anything about the purpose. Why did the natives have sea otter bones in the middens? How did they use them? Was it for regalia and wealth and stewardship? Was it for food? Was it all of the above? Again, thanks to Peter Hatch for this slide. Sea otters were very important in coastal native cultures. They represented regalia and wealth and stewardship. The natives, as later European traders, recognized that sea otter pelts were very luxurious and very difficult to hunt. So sea otter pelts, especially winter robes, mark the owner as a person of wealth and prestige. With sea otters. I'm going to give you a couple of small examples from Coos County, who married the merman. Quote, then the next day she got ready and went. She wore 5 sea otter hides. The flood tide came early in the morning. They saw a sea otter swim in the river. They hunted the sea otter in canoes. She was swimming along the beach. They were shooting at her. It seemed that they hit the sea otter, but come out again, and the arrows were to be seen. And then from another tale, well, that whale washed ashore right at Sunset Bay. And the place where whales come. Another story about a woman who went for a year as a present to her people.
It seems that the audio is cutting in and out for those that are watching.
Okay.
So I want to try something really quick. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Shall I put it up a little bit?
Let's try that first.
Okay. How about that?
Yeah, and tell Ron he needs to pin the speaker box. He needs to click, no, not you. Tell Ron who's watching right now. Tell Ron he needs to click on the box that's the speaker, because he gets a gallery view and he wants to see only you and your slides. So tell him to click on them.
Oh, click on the.
Click on the picture of you to enlarge it.
Okay, Ron, click on the picture of me to enlarge it, of the slides, so that you don't just have a gallery view.
And ask the audience if the audio is any better now.
Okay, audience, can you let us know if the audio has improved?
Okay, go ahead and we'll try something.
Okay, so now I want to, okay, good. I want to give a couple of examples of native otter hunting prior to the coming of European and Americans. On the South Coast, one elder said, quote, sea otters slept on their backs in the kelp weed patches, but they were wary little animals and dove down in the kelp weed, so the hunters could get only a few at a time. Then they fought the rough water and waited for the sea otter to come up for air. When the crippled animals were harpooned and pulled in with a rope, they put up a vicious fight, and sometimes the men got clawed and badly injured. Sometimes the canoe smashed against the rocks, and then the hunters didn't come home. That's from Beverly Ward's book, White Moccasins. And then something about native sea otter hunting on the North Coast by Mrs. Frances Fuller Victor, who was an early Oregon historian. The canoes of these people, the Columbia River natives, were each cut out of a single log of cedar and were often 30 feet long and 5 wide at midships. The oars were about 5 feet long and bent in the shape of a crescent, which shape enabled them to draw them edgewise through the water with little or no noise. This noiselessness being an important quality of hunting the sea otter, which is always caught sleeping on the rocks. So now that we've taken a very brief glimpse of native traditions and the sea otter, let's start looking at the maritime fur trade. First of all, how did the sea otter become so important, so valuable, that so many hunted it for so long? And the answer lies in a country very far away, China. And it actually begins long before the sea otter trade began. Manchuria, which is now in the northern part of China, conquered the rest of China beginning in 1644, and the Ming dynasty of China collapsed. It took the Manchurians some 40 years to consolidate their rule. The Manchurians, in the eyes of the conquered Chinese, were barbarians from the north. They ate wild meat, they wore furs of wild animals, and they had odd hairstyles, the kinds of problems that and cultural clashes that occur when one culture conquers another one. In Manchurian culture, the nobility wore black fox and sable. Royalty wore robes trimmed with sea otter fur. As you can see in this painting, this is a painting of the Qianlong Emperor, who, as you can see, reigned until 1796. And his royal robes there are trimmed with sea otter fur. You can see the dark fur trim on his robe. In Manchurian society, those with close ties to Manchu rulers, such as brides of imperial grandchildren and the fathers of the brides, also received furs. And beginning in about 1704, Manchurian rulers awarded black fox fur hats and otter fur war skirts and sable riding gowns to honored soldiers. So there was a big market for both land furs like sable and fox fur and for sea animals in Manchurian China. By the 18th century, Chinese markets integrated and expanded, and anyone could wear sea otter fur who could afford the price. And that was not everybody, because the sea otter fur was always expensive, but it was no longer just limited solely to the royalty and the upper nobility. The last quarter of the 18th century and the early 19th century was crucial to the sea otter trade. The ecology collapsed. The sea otters in the waters of the world could not sustain the amount of hunting and pursuit that was being fueled by human demand. Just one little statistic to give you a sense of it. In 1806, Canton, which was a major seaport, imported 17,446 sea otter pelts. In 1831, 329. Right, so you can really see that things collapsed. And at the same time, of course, because of the increasing scarcity, the average price per pelt quadrupled between 1806 and 1831, due to the fact that there were fewer sea otters to hunt. So there we go. The question is, Oregon is rarely mentioned in the annals of the fur trade, and the question really has been, who extirpated the sea otters here? And there's 3 stages which are semi-overlapping, but we'll take them here one by one. The first stage of the maritime fur trade was the early foreign ship trading for sea otters. And usually historians date that to the publication of Captain James Cook's third voyage journals. And on this third voyage, he went all the way up the Northwest coast and to Alaska more than once. And while he was in the north, his crew bartered for some sea otter pelts for warmth. It's cold up there. But when they went to China, they were able to get astronomical prices for these sea otter pelts that they had bargained for not very much, because they just wanted them as blankets. So when Cook's journals were published and the astronomical prices paid for sea otter pelts became common knowledge, that initiated the fur trade. Initially from the British, the first ship to the Northwest coast for the sea otter trade was the British ship named the Sea Otter in 1789. This rather zoned out photo of a sea otter is artist James Weber. And I have that in here to show you that that's not really quite exactly what a sea otter looks like. It you can't really mistake it for something other than a sea otter, but it doesn't look exactly like a sea otter. And the reason is that people don't get it all right when they first see something that they haven't seen before. It takes a little while to become familiar with something. So that was the best that Cook's crew could do. Now, as I said, the first ships to come hunt or come trade for sea otters were British, but within a decade of 1789, the trade was taken over by the Americans. And most of the American ships were from Boston for historical reasons that I won't go into, as a result of which the natives of the Northwest Coast referred to the American traders as Boston men. This painting shows Robert Gray and George Vancouver meeting at sea off the Northwest Coast. So the thing to remember about this first phase of the maritime fur trade is that the British and the Americans were traders. They were not hunters. They didn't have the skills to hunt sea otters. They didn't know anything about sea otter habitats. They were maritime, there was a maritime culture, obviously, or they wouldn't have been able to sail the ships, but it wasn't a local maritime animal hunting culture. The actual hunting of the otters for trade was done by the Northwest Coast Indians in exchange for the trade goods that the Europeans and Americans offered. And the entire market, as I said before, was incentivized by China, which was the destination of all the pelts. So, you know, Robert Gray is famous as being the first European or American to cross the then treacherous and still treacherous Columbia River Bar. It's important to say here that there was a lot of competition between the traders on the coast, between California and Alaska. Any trader who found a good community of a village or town of native peoples willing to trade and skilled in sea otter hunting, and who were able to get good prices, generally kept that information from fellow traders. There was very high competition, which has worked very much against historians' efforts to find out who did what and where they did it. There's a picture of Gray in the mouth of the Columbia, and it was something quite like this. The ship furled its sails and indicated that it wanted to trade, and the natives came out in their canoes, and trading and bargaining would begin. Now I want to go a little bit from and look at what happened with the maritime ships on each portion of the coast. And I don't have paintings about it because there wasn't anybody there with painting skills or sketching skills, because, as I said, the traders were all very competitive with one another. We're going to start from the south coast and go north, and that's because the records seem to indicate that some of the best habitat is on the south coast. So we'll follow where the otters seem to, as far as we can tell, really their habitat best. So on the south coast, say Coos and Curry counties, there's very few trading ship logs that we know of so far that mention trading on the south coast. The data that pins down sea otter populations is scanty and contradictory. The ship Ruby in 1795 mentions trading in what's now Coos County. The Jenny, which was a sister ship of the Ruby, in the summer of 1791 reported trading for only a few sea otter pelts at the mouth of the Umpqua River. But, and here's an example of the vexing contradictoriness that bedevils the historian. John Boyd recorded on the Columbia in April 1792, so between 1791 in the summer and the spring of 1792, he recorded at the same place that we purchased of them many fine otter skins for copper and iron. So the Jenny said, yeah, only a few, we didn't have good luck. The Columbia a few months later said, we had great luck. We purchased many fine otter skins. So it's a little hard to know. It's a little hard to get a sense of what happened. Did the otter population shift or change? Did the natives move away and were no longer wanted to trade? Had somebody else come in the meantime and snapped up all of the available pelts? We don't know. On the North Coast, so here we are here, Robert Gray and John Mears, who was a British, well-known British trader, both came to Tillamook County in 1788. Gray entered Tillamook Bay to trade, but ended up in an altercation with a young crew member of his, Marcus Lopius, who was a native of the Cape Verde Islands, was on shore cutting grass and helping replenish the ship. And he started to yell, saying that one of the natives had stolen his sickle, and he gave chase. And other crew members who were unarmed saw, or at least recorded in the journal, that they saw the natives killing Lopius. Whether or not that actually happened, we don't know, because the crew went back to the ship, and the ship tried to leaving Tillamook Bay because of contrary winds. And that brings up another point that's really important in the fur trade in Oregon, which is our coast does not have a large number, or even a small number, of bays that are big enough for these large European ocean-going ships. That made a big difference in how much trading took place in the maritime era. Gray later named Tillamook Bay Murderers Harbor because of the loss of his crew member there. But the other important thing for historians from that story, apart from that altercation, that fight, is that Gray got into Tillamook Bay and had trouble getting out, and future ships did not try to go in there because the word went out in the trading community that the bay was small, the bar was dangerous, the winds were contrary. The one harbor that is very frequently mentioned in trader accounts is this one, the Columbia River Estuary. It's the only harbor that we know of that traders used consistently despite its very dangerous bar. After 1795, something like 12 to 14 ships wintered in the Columbia Lower Estuary, in part or in whole, trading. The Chinook people of Columbia River Estuary were some of the most astute traders on the entire coast, and well known for their skill and their vast trading networks. So it was, from the traders' point of view, as well as from the Chinook point of view, it was a good place for ships to winter in part or in whole. Now, I want to talk briefly about a couple of other items that became really important in the fur trade in Oregon. The Columbia region especially had two other items trading ships could purchase for trade goods and then sell to northern tribes in return for sea otter pellets. For example, up in Alaska, what's now what's called in the records clamels or clamens. This is a Tlingit example from up further north in the Alaska area. Clamens are made of stiffened elk hide, and they were capable of repelling arrows. And the clamens were in high demand among northern tribes, and the Chinook either manufactured or traded for them and had many available for the traders. So the traders purchased them with copper or iron or beads or whatever the natives wanted by way of trade, and then carry them further north and sell them or barter them to the northern tribes for sea otter pelts. The other item was slaves. Many Northwest Coast Native societies were slaveholding cultures, and slaves were generally owned by the wealthy, the title holders. The Chinook and peoples of the Columbia Mouth region were a slave raiding and trading group of the Northwest Coast, often raiding tribes far to the south. The importance of this for the sea otter trade is that, to an undetermined extent that historians just cannot untangle, the native slave trade became a part of, or became integrated into, the sea otter trade. And the reason that historians can't figure it out is that the captains who were involved in participating in slave trade didn't usually talk about it. But apparently what would occur is they would purchase slaves on the Columbia and take them further north and then sell them for sea otter pelts to the north. We have a few indications of this. Russian Naval Lieutenant Otto von Kotzebue, in his 1821 memoir, said, Quote, for the purpose of buying slaves, the American ships repaired to the northwest coast of America in latitude 45 degrees. That's the Columbia, where the population is numerous. Proceeding, they are better paid for men than skins. The natives turn to the trade of kidnapping and barter them with the ships. When in this manner, the ship is well loaded with slaves, they go north as high as latitude 55 degrees, where the natives purchase these people for slavery for sea otter skins. We also know of one ship, one American ship for sure that was involved in this trade. Captain George Ayers of the Mercury was captured as a sea otter smuggler by the Spanish in 1813. And it was a very long, involved bureaucratic process. He ended up spending the rest of his life in New Spain, which then later became Mexico. But when he was caught by a privateer off the coast of what's now Santa Barbara, in addition to himself and the crew, he had a slave boy, which he had purchased on the Columbia River. And that's right there in the Spanish records to tell us. Okay, now we get to the second level of the fur trade, early explorers and fur traders by land. And this, as I said, they're slightly overlapping. So the maritime fur trade was still continuing, but there was more of an effort to do things by land. Early fur trade companies and early explorers were coming to the coast. And again, I'm going to go from the south to the north. So in Coos County, Alexander Roderick McLeod expedition in 1826 and 1827 came to mainly Coos County, and there was trading that occurred as part of that. The Jedediah Smith expedition, which is this painting shows, this painting is in Charleston. He had a trip up the coast in 1828, trading for sea otter and other furs in the Coos Bay region in July of 1828 on the general route to Fort Vancouver. The expedition was cut short by a massacre of 15 of the expedition's men on the Umpqua River in July of 1828 by a group of Coquille warriors, which was due to misunderstandings and unresolved grievances, failure to communicate, all the ugly things that happen when cultures clash instead of meet. And then in Lincoln County, moving north here, McLeod also journeyed up to the Alsea in summer of 1826, a little before. He explored the Yacuna River, Beaver Creek, down the Siuslaw, both trapping and hunting with the County. The Lewis and Clark expedition wintered November 1805 to March 1806 in Clatsop County. Trading with Clatsop, Tillamook, and Chinook peoples for sea otter pelts. Overall, the Lewis and Clark journals are some of the best information that we have about the trading acumen of the peoples of the Northwest Coast, of our Northwest Coast, and the importance of sea otter pelts and the value that the native peoples attach to them. Just for an example, William Clark wrote on March 19th of 1806, quote, "The women also wore a robe much smaller than that of the men, hangs loosely over the shoulders and back. The most esteemed and valuable of those robes are made of strips of the skin of the sea otter, together with the bark of the white cedar or silk grass." Sea otter pelts were highly esteemed, especially the robes of 2 or 3 skins. Joseph Whitehouse, for example, said in November 23, 1805, "I mention this in order to show the high value that they set on these skins, which were very beautiful." And Lewis and Clark both mentioned the connoisseurs that the Clatsop and the Chinook were in the arts of bargaining. Clark wrote on December 12th of 1805, "They are close dealers and stickle for a very little, never close a bargain except they think they have the advantage, value blue beads highly, white they also prize, but not any other color do they value in the least." And it was this that led to the Lewis and Clark expedition not bringing home very many sea otter pelts. They could have purchased more, but they did not have enough blue beads. And like people everywhere, the peoples of the Columbia region valued some things very much and other things not so much. The next person I want to talk about is Chinook Chief Concomly.
Sharing your
This
screen.
may or may not be an actual likeness. We don't know for sure. It was a painting that accompanied an article in the Daily Astorian in the early 1800s by an anonymous artist. So whether it is Concomly or not, we don't know, but it's the only possible likeness we have. Chief Concomly had created a fur empire of his own that was, and he was a very subtle trader and bargainer, and his exploits and his far-flung powers are frequently mentioned in accounts of the time. Alexander Henry, for example, who was of the Northwest Company, later merged with the Hudson's Bay Company. Henry came to Astoria as part of the transfer of that fort to the British during the War of 1812. And he is famous for his extensive, wordy, detailed journal, which it provides some of the best early information we have about the region. And in his journal, he described Concomly's wealth of furs, his fur empire, and his canny, far-flung trading activities in the region. And then a second, not the only, but a second reference comes from Father Pierre-Jean de Smet, who was a Catholic missionary, and he visited Fort Vancouver, which by that time was Hudson's Bay Company headquarters, in 1846. And he heard stories about Chief Concomly, who had died about 15 years before, that Concomly would come to the fort with 300 slaves and carpet the walkway to the fort door with beaver and sea otter skins for him to walk on to go meet John McLaughlin, the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company. So the point of which is to say that the fur otter trade, the sea otter trade, even as it was changing over to land furs like beaver, offered opportunities for not only Europeans and Americans, but also native traders who were skilled in bargaining and trading, like the Chinook, to have fur empires of their own. Okay, now, stage 2.5, the fur companies. So we did the maritime trading, we did the early explorers. So this is, most of the early explorers were in fact affiliated with one or another of the fur companies. So this is kind of 3 or maybe 2.5 on the stage of the fur trade discussion. The first, one of the first companies in the region was the Pacific Fur Company, which was John Jacob Astor's company. He founded Astoria in 1811, and there it is in its tiny little beginnings. But he didn't have it for very long because the War of 1812 started, and it was surrendered to the British in 1812 as part of the war, and it was renamed Fort George. And the Northwest Company was managed it as a fur trading fort until it was returned to American sovereignty in 1818. And there's an interesting quote from the government official who was present to take back American sovereignty, exchange of flags, a ritual acknowledgement of change of sovereignty. He wrote to the Secretary of State in November 11th, 1818, "A few days thereafter, to wit, on the 6th, I received in the name of the United States the possession of the establishment at Fort George. This outlet at the mouth of the Columbia embraces the entire range of country from the ocean to the mountains. The ocean teems with otter, the seal, and the whale." So it would seem from his testimony in 1818 that there were still sea otters in the region. The Hudson's Bay Company took over from Northwest Company in 1821 when the British government forcibly merged the two companies because they were involved in a cutthroat competition throughout various parts of Canada and the United States, and it was really getting out of hand. So after the merger, The Hudson's Bay Company had 3 forts in our region: Fort George, that is Astoria, Fort Vancouver, which later became the headquarters of the Columbia District, and Fort Umpqua down on the Umpqua River, where the town of Elkton is now, is where Fort Umpqua was located. John McLaughlin, the chief factor of the Columbia District, was the head of the Columbia District from 1824 until 1845, and he oversaw Hudson's Bay Company operations in our area. The important thing to realize about the Hudson's Bay Company is that their principal focus was beaver, not sea otter. They were not a sea otter hunting company. They didn't have hunting skills. They didn't hire natives to do hunting, like some other, we'll talk in a minute about who did hire natives to hunt, but the Hudson's Bay Company did not. However, if sea otters were offered by natives or by their own trappers who traded for them among the coastal natives, they were always much appreciated, and they always brought the highest price. If you look at the Hudson's Bay records, even though sea otters are like 0.15% of the total number of furs, they command the highest price by far. So I just mentioned that someone did hire natives to hunt sea otters. Its partners. So in many ways, the sea otter trade, the fur trade, specifically for sea otters, started not with James Cook. That's only the Anglo-American trade. Really, it started with the Russians. The Russians discovered Alaska for themselves in the Vitus Bering voyage of 1741. In that schematic map there, you can see they started from the Kamchatka Peninsula, and after a great deal of difficulty, because the Bering Sea, as we now know it, is a very stormy northern ocean, they around Alaska. The first Russian settlement in Alaska was at Three Saints Harbor on Kodiak Island, set up in 1784 by Grigory Shelikov, who was an early fur trader. So the Russian-American Company was chartered in 1799 to bring order to the Russian sea otter hunting trading entrepreneurs in the Aleutians and in Alaska. Russia had a whole class of kind of freewheeling entrepreneurs that are called promyshleniki in Russian, and they just camp out on the Aleutians and hunt sea otters and also oppress and act sometimes extremely terribly and violently to the natives. And word of all this got back to the seat of the empire. And so the Russian-American Company was chartered to have a complete monopoly on furs. And that did calm things down to some extent, but it did not lessen the number of sea otters who were killed up in the Alaska Aleutian area. The head of the Russian American Company from 1799 to 1818 was Alexander Baranov. He was the governor of Russian America and a hugely important official in the history of Russian Alaska. He and some of his officials had an expansion interest on the Columbia River, but it didn't work out for a variety of reasons, but partly because he recognized American interests in the Columbia region, and he opted to have a Russian settlement further south. But also his kind of recognition of American interest in the Columbia region was nudged along heavily by the wreck of the colonizing ship he sent, the Nikolai, in 1808. It was wrecked along the Olympic Peninsula, and it was the whole process of setting up a colony on the northwest coast was wrecked along with the Nikolai. So subsequently, the Russians, their colony at Fort Ross, which is in Northern California, that's the Orthodox Church at Fort Ross. It is now a California state park. So unlike the Americans or the British, the Russians actually did hunt sea otters. And the way that they did this was with forced labor contracts with the Aleut and Kodiak peoples who the Russians conquered. the Aleuts and the Kodiaks had a marine mammal hunting tradition. It was a deep skill and a highly important part of their culture. And so on forced labor contracts, the Russians would be able to go to the Aleutians or down the Alaskan and British Columbia coast and actually hunt the sea otters with the Aleuts on board. They were highly skilled. All contemporary accounts of those who saw the hunters praised their skill. Now, how did the Americans get involved in this? Well, Baranof did business with the American fur traders for purchase of supplies. It's not much, agricultural land up there in what's now Sitka. It's cold and damp, and a lot of supplies were lacking, and it was very difficult to bring supplies over the Bering Sea from the Kamchatka Peninsula. So Baranof did regular business with the American traders to bring supplies up from, say, California, and then paid them in furs. But then once the sea otters began to thin out in the Aleutians and in Alaska, he began to contract with some American traders to take Aleuts on board the American ships with a Russian overseer and take them south and illegally hunt otters in Spanish California waters. And then take all the furs that they illegally hunted and go back up to Sitka and share with the Russian American company on a predetermined basis of, you get half, we get half. So this might seem kind of exotic, but it worked out fairly well for quite a while. The first contract with an American ship trader to take Aleuts on board with a Russian overseer was in 1804 with Joseph O'Kane, who was captain of his ship, which was called the O'Kane. Joseph O'Kane did not suffer from, like humility problems. He had a ship, he called it the O'Kane. And then there were quite a few other captains after. There's lists in Russian documents of the captains that Baranof contracted with to take Aleuts, sometimes 20 hunters, sometimes 50, with a Russian overseer and hunt sea otters and increasingly also fur seals down in California. The question is, did this include Oregon? After all the ships going to Alaska to California, they unavoidably had to sail by the Oregon coast. It seems possible, but all the sources currently located are inconclusive. So we don't know for sure. Part of the problem was that Oregon was not a defined region with a name or an identity among the contending colonial powers, which included America, Britain, and Russia at the least, and also the Spanish, who were trying to maintain their claims to the Northwest coast. Oregon was just part of the Northwest coast, and the Northwest coast included a vast territory from California to Alaska. Like, it's an enormous slice of territory. And Oregon didn't really have a name or a place on the map until the founding of Astoria on the Columbia. So now we get to the fourth and final phase of the extermination of sea otters in Oregon, which is local otter hunting. After the maritime trade, after the explorers, after the fur companies, once you had American settlers on the coast working with and living among the natives who still lived on the coast, despite forced relocation to reservations and much loss from diseases to which they had no immunity. There was quite a bit of local otter hunting. Interestingly, once again, most of the records for local otter hunting are on the South Coast, whereas most of the records for the maritime fur trade, which we started with, are for the North Coast because all the ships entered into the Columbia, and they would write it in their logs that they were entering into the Columbia River. They didn't have a bay to enter into down south. So starting in Curry County for local otter hunting, there appear to have been otters in Curry County in the 1850s and 60s, even into the 1890s. This is a picture of the Battle Rock conflict in what's now Port Orford, when a American sea captain decided to file a donation land claim act for lands at the Port Orford area and left to settlers. And there was a skirmish with the local native peoples in which many native peoples died, but the native warriors died. The settlers managed to escape by night and get away from Port Orford. And in a article about it years later, that occurred in 1851. And in an article in 1886, one newspaper wrote, "The discovery of the white Port Orford cedar was made then at the Battle Rock event, and it existed in immense forests. There were great flocks of pigeons. Sea otter were seen in the water nearby, while signs of elk, deer, and bear were all around them." And even as late as 1892, a newspaper reported Charles Crew of Port Orford killed a fine sea otter last week. Now, killing one sea otter doesn't mean that the ocean was teeming with sea otters at that point, but it means that there were at least a few. Moving a little bit north, we have one invaluable piece of information about the sea otter hunting activities in Coos County. A traveler named William Wells wrote an article called "Wildlife in Oregon" for Harper's New Monthly Magazine in October of 1856, which is very early for the Oregon coast. And one of his stories was about hunting sea otters in Coos Bay with a native guide. And they saw two females that each had 2 pups. So that's an indication that there was some kind of breeding population at that time, because females do not generally move around much, especially if they have pups. And in Coos County, sea otters are still mentioned in articles from 1885, even 1904 and 1907, but again, just one otter at a time, like this one from the Coos Bay Times in 1907 from Bandon. A sea otter worth $500 was found on the beach the other day by William Height. He had been killed by the surf among the rocks. So in Lincoln County, sea otters are mentioned as late as 1896 and 1902, but again, only 1 or 2 at a time. There's an excellent piece of Yaquina Native testimony that concerns sea otters about a very unhappy event. An attack in 1832 by Hudson's Bay Company personnel on Yaquina people in retaliation for the Alsea people killing 2 trappers. In other words, Hudson's Bay Company made a mistake about who they were punishing for the killing of 2 trappers, even if they should have been punishing anybody at all. So Cookwell Thompson, who was an Athapascan, told anthropologist John Harrington that the hunters, quote, "came trapping to that lake inland of where Seal Rock is," the little town still there. And the party stayed there all winter, getting beaver skins, sea otter skins, muskrat skins just piled up. The Alsea and Yaquina people did not know how many beaver hides they got, maybe 200 pounds, and fisher skins like sea otter. And then there is a article from the Corvallis paper in 1902. This valuable sea otter skin is the property of Joseph Briggs, who was a half-Siletz hunter and local resident, who killed the animal in the ocean just off Otter Rock. The otter was shot by Mr. Briggs while it played in the surf 200 or 300 yards from shore. The feat was a difficult one. So then further north, we get to Tillamook County, and that's the main reason I have this slide up here. This shows the coast reservation, which the whole colored area shows the whole coast reservation, and then the areas that were taken out for and opened up to Anglo-American settlement at different times. And the reason I have that up there is because neither I nor any other historian has ever been able to give any account of sea otters in Tillamook County, not local newspapers, not early settler accounts, no letters, nothing mentions of sea otters in Tillamook County, though we recall that Robert Gray went into Tillamook Bay in 1792 and or 1788 and traded for sea otter skins before relations took an ugly turn. So what possible is that since much of Tillamook County was in the Coast Reservation in this time period, it may be that only natives or Anglo-Americans who were living in the reservation and had close ties to the natives killed sea otters on the Tillamook coast. That's just a supposition. We don't know. One of the things for historians to do is to try to figure out, what was the sea otter population in Tillamook County. Then to Clatsop County, as of 1889, news articles in the Daily Astorian reported that sea otters had almost disappeared. This picture of the schooner Kate and Anne, or Kate and Anna, it was a sealing schooner mainly, though they also hunted sea otter on the Oregon coast, and they were active from about on our coast from about 1883 to 1898. And the newspapers along the coast avidly followed the activities of the Kate and Anne. And the only thing that the papers can report that with respect to sea otters, they caught 3 smallish sea otters in 1898. They did fine with sealing, but there were very few sea otters. It was wrecked in 1902 in the Channel Islands of California, as you can see, people having fun on the wrecked ship. In 1887, the Astorian said, "There isn't much in the fur trade of Astoria to furnish an item at present. Still a little is doing. Beaver pelts come in and are quoted at $3.50 a pound. Land otter skins sell at $5 each. Few sea otter skins, and they are the way from $60 to $125. So you see the price differential. The sea otter skins were always the king of the pelts. So then we get to the ugly end of the story: population collapse and complete extirpation. The Medford newspaper in 1910. Sea lion hunters off the Oregon coast have had a good season. In 2 months, one schooner's crew killed 40 sea lions and 1 otter. The skin of the latter is worth from $300 to $500. Notice how high the price has gone as the availability has gone down. It is rare that a sea otter is killed on the Oregon coast. And then the final, pretty much the final elegy in the Sunday Oregonian in 1913. The sea otter is one of the furs that already cannot be bought. It is an example of what other precious furs will be in the near future. The poor beast has been persecuted out of existence. So there we are, the end of the sea otters in Oregon. So what's the solution to that ugly, sad tragedy? Restore them. A few sea otters survived the fur trade and the fur hunting. There was one group in California that survived, and a few pockets of sea otters also survived up in Alaska. There was a translocation of Alaskan sea otters to Oregon and another to Washington at the same time in 1970 from Amchitka Island, because the US government was going to explode an underwater or an underground nuclear test, the Canakin test, which they subsequently did. And it was known from earlier underground nuclear tests that underground and underwater tests that it would affect the sea otter population. So sea otters were brought to Washington and to Oregon. The Washington population at the Olympic Peninsula subsequently flourished, but the Oregon population subsequently faded out completely. 93 otters from Amchitka were translocated to the Oregon South Coast, off Coos Bay in Port Orford. This shows the Cape Arago site. They all vanished within 10 years of their release, but only 8.4% mortality as far as anybody knew. The big problem is nobody monitored the sea otters. There wasn't anybody around watching to see what happened. So did they emigrate home? Were they killed? Did they disperse? Was it the wrong subspecies? Nobody knows. So the problem with a new translocation would be, is there adequate habitat? The location of best habitat has changed due to diking, jetties, and kelp destruction via climate change, making many areas that used to be rich kelp forests into sea urchin barrens. Generally speaking, where coastal natives described otter hunting in places like Otter Rock, Sunset Bay, Whiskey Run Beach, Rogue River Reef, is roughly where modern habitat modeling shows that otters would thrive again. As I said before, the historical sources are completely unclear. The early maritime records focus only on the Columbia River because that's where the traders were able to get into. Local hunting sources later show Coos and Curry counties as the main population areas, and they're the ones with the last hunting records. What does that tell us? Well, at least it tells us that there were otters both on the north coast and the south coast, but it's impossible to get any sense of the population from that data. The other problem with a new translocation would be human disturbance. Conflicts with fisheries, for example. Oregon's largest commercial fishery is the Dungeness crab fishery, which brings in millions and millions of dollars annually. And it's also, in some instances anyhow, a favored prey of sea otters. And there's potential conflicts could be with boating and shipping as well. Sea otters are in the near shore rather than further out, so it would be near shore conflicts. So, after the failure of the 1970 translocation, there's been efforts to try again. And David Hatch of the Sollettes founded the original Elaka Alliance years ago in order to start bringing people together, scientists, community members, tribes, environmental organizations to try again. And the Elaka Alliance has been rejuvenated recently. I'm on the board and doing a lot of the historical work. And one of the things that's happened quite recently was OSU master's student Dominique Cohn did a master's thesis on how and where sea otters could be best restored in Oregon. And his findings were really interesting. He's found via habitat modeling that sea otters would most likely thrive along the southern coastline where there are high quality nearshore reefs at Orford, Blanco, and Simpson. Secondarily, just south of Newport and the north coast near the Columbia. Interestingly, there's little sea otter habitat in the established marine reserves. Also, Oregon has bull kelp rather than giant kelp, which is less persistent and has less cover than the larger giant kelp, which is more common down in California. Otters do flourish in estuaries, and all of Oregon's estuaries, as small as they are, appear to have good potential sea otter habitat. All the good density, high density habitats are within 50 kilometers of at least one of our estuaries. There's the Cape Blanco area, one area where sea otters would probably flourish when we get to the point of really pinning down where a new translocation should take place. All the areas that Dominique identified have high potential spatial conflict with human activities, but not necessarily frequent. And that's really the key. And what the Elaka Alliance is doing is working on the scientific studies to determine what the best way is to go. Our feasibility study just came out, and we just had a symposium, an online symposium, talking with the scientists who did the feasibility study. An economic study is underway. There will be further studies narrowing down where the best habitat is. There's also a question in Oregon about which subspecies. There's a northern subspecies of sea otter and a southern subspecies of sea otter. And the historical and archaeological data seems to indicate that Oregon was the mixing ground for the two subspecies. So the question is, should we bring in otters from Alaska or British Columbia or California, or how does the subspecies difference make a difference in what should be done with possible translocation? So there's lots of studies still before us, much community outreach in the effort to work with the crabbing industry, with the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, with communities that depend on fishing, because sea otters are not only top predators, but they're what's called keystone species, where they live and flourish. It changes the marine ecosystem. They eat sea urchins, which prey on kelp forests. So in areas with high sea otter density, there's much richer kelp forest, which changes the profile of the fish in the area. So there's many unanswered questions, but they're an important part of the ecosystem on the Oregon coast. And we haven't seen those furry faces for more than 100 years. Thank you.
Go ahead and on that last slide.
Yeah, let's turn that off.
Center stage here, a little bit closer to the camera, please. Okay, that's good.
Is that good? Okay. Questions from either online or people in the room? I surely didn't talk you to death. Surely not.
Well, I put this question in
I
chat.
heard recently the Oregon Zoo has a new pup, from somewhere in San Diego.
Repeat the question.
Okay.
So the audience heard it.
So the gentleman in the audience said the Oregon Zoo has, he's heard, just acquired a new Sea Otter pup from San Diego. And I haven't seen a picture of that pup yet. I think I did see an article about it. There are a few, quite a few aquariums and zoos that have captive sea otters. In Oregon, the zoo in Portland has sea otters, which is where the new pup is. The Newport Aquarium also has sea otters. That's where I've seen the sea otters that I've seen is at the Newport Aquarium.
And when Ellen just asked that question,
Where
the sea otters at the aquarium, are they sea otters or river otters? So you answered her question.
they're sea otters. They may also have river otters. I'm not sure. When I went to the Newport Aquarium, I only had eyes for the sea otters. So I didn't notice if there were river otters there. The sea otters are a very popular exhibit at the Newport Aquarium. And that's probably for many reasons. But one of them is surely is that they mostly lie on their back. And if they have babies, they hold the baby on their stomach. So you have a mother sea otter in the water with a little fuzzy baby on her stomach. And they will dive down to get the food that they eat, like sea urchins and abalone and crab, and come back up to the surface and then lie on their back. And with their hands, they crack open the shells and then eat them and work with their babies, if they have a baby, teaching them how to do it. And it's all very visible and obvious to humans. It's not hidden. They also groom constantly because their fur is hugely important. As I said at the beginning, they don't have blubber. If they're going to stay nice and warm in cold northern waters, it's fur or nothing. So they're always grooming, and they're always doing like this sort of thing. They look like they're getting ready for a ball or something. And I've seen people in front of the aquarium going, "Oh, look at that. They're brushing their hair." Yeah, they are brushing their hair. They're grooming to make sure that air is staying in under the fur and insulating them properly.
Susan, you have to repeat the question. Susan wants to know how far upriver will sea otters swim, for example, the Columbia?
How far upriver will sea otters swim, for example, the Columbia? This is a hugely contested question. It's a very good question. I like that question, but I can't give a good answer, unfortunately. The interesting thing is early explorers, some said, Lewis and Clark said, for example, that they saw sea otters up at the Great Falls, presumably meaning Celilo Falls. And then they later say in their journals that the Indians have undeceived them, that those were not sea otters, that sea otters stay out by the ocean, and those were seals or river otters. Some early explorers said that they did see sea otters up the river system, and other explorers said, no, they're only down by the ocean, like right by the estuary mouth and out into the ocean. So we don't know for sure. The early exploration accounts are contradictory. One thing we do know is that some biologists and researchers have pointed out that sea otters they changed their behavior as the hunting became heavier on them. And whereas they used to hang out on rocks, like sea lions do, and even give birth ashore, that they changed that behavior and spent much more time at sea or on impossible to reach offshore rocks. And that it may be that the reason the early explorer accounts are so contradictory is because different men were seeing different sea otter behaviors as they changed their behaviors under the pressure of hunting. Sea otters have been observed up rivers, even above the head of tide where there's really no more salt water or not very much salt water. They can survive in fresh water, at least for a time. So I think that we will have to say that the jury is out on this. The contradiction means something. The contradiction in the early reports means something, but we don't exactly know yet what it means. There is so much room for more research. Yeah.
Do you have any idea when the next attempt to place some off the coast will happen?
Do I know when the next attempt to place them off the coast will happen? No, not exactly, because that's the Elaka Alliance's ultimate purpose. But we have more studies to go. The feasibility study was the first, is the first pulling together of the scientific data. There will be further studies that are required by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service after that. Then when we or another entity requests a permit for translocation, that will trigger the NEPA process, the National Environmental Policy Act, which will probably require an environmental impact statement to really look at what the options and the alternatives and the problems or the potential problems. And in our case, we have a heavier burden than another place might have because we had a translocation that failed. And the first thing that any wildlife agency would say is, so it failed. Why is it going to not fail this time? What are you doing differently? How are you mitigating against another failure? So we have perhaps a heavier burden than some other location might have. Depending on how things go, surely a few years before that would happen. And it depends a lot on how smoothly the scientific and bureaucratic and legal processes go. Complicated. Yes.
Does the oil spills in Alaska affect the local groups of the sea otters?
Eliminate them? Do the oil spills in Alaska affect the sea otters up there and perhaps eliminate them? I'm not a maven in what happens in Alaska, but yes, in general, oil spills do affect sea otters because they are nearshore animals, and that's where oil derricks tend to be. They're not out in the middle of the farthest deep sea. They're fairly near shore, and oil spill covers many acres often of marine habitat as well as beaches, and sea otters are drastically affected by oil spills because their fur is so important. No blubber. So if once their fur becomes coated with oil, they are basically really in trouble. So there's efforts to clean them and to help them after oil spills. I don't really know how effective that is. The most effective thing to do with respect to oil and sea otters is make sure they don't meet each other.
What's the main difference between river otters and sea otters?
What's the main difference between river otters and sea otters? They're cousins. Well, let's start there. But the basic differences are that river otters live in freshwater environments mainly, and sea otters live in ocean environments mainly. Sea otters can and do go upriver into freshwater. River otters are often seen down on the coast. I have friends who've seen them on the coast often, like right on the coast, walking on the beach the way people do. So there's not a hard and fast rule, but sea otters are generally in the sea. River otters are generally in the freshwater. Other differences, river otters have a very long tail, whereas sea otters have a more short paddled, semi-paddled tail. Sea otters float a lot on their back. River otters swim forward. You'll see a river otter with its head just above the water swimming up the river. Sea otters don't usually do that. Elaka Alliance occasionally gets reports of people seeing sea otters, but when they start to describe the sea otter that they saw, it turns out to be a river otter. Because they're both playful and around in coastal regions, if they both are in an area, they're easy to mistake for one another, but they are different. Is there a difference in size? Yes, but it's a little hard to tell. Sea otters are generally more compact because they're in colder waters, and their feet are more paddle-ish than river otters. And river otters are more slender and they have a long tail. Yeah.
What's a native?
What's a native?
Maybe sharks kill them?
Will sharks kill them? Yes, sharks will kill them. And sharks has become a serious problem in California. As you saw from the initial slide about the sea otter habitat range, sea otters have reclaimed a small portion of their range in California, not the entire by any means, but a small portion. And one of the reasons that they are not expanding is great white shark attacks. Researchers are working on this problem because generally speaking, great whites don't eat sea otters. Sea otters are basically, from a shark's point of view, a mouthful of fur. They're not, juicy, they're furry. So this is not very interesting if you're looking for dinner. What seems to be happening is that perhaps juvenile sharks are taking bites out of sea otters to see if they would make a good dinner, and they decide that it wouldn't, but the bite is enough to kill the sea otter. So there has certainly been quite a bit of that. And that's a serious problem in California to otters expanding their habitat, the shark attacks. Why there are more shark attacks than there used to be is not clear. It may have to do with climate change, with shifting areas of kelp forests. This is still an very active area of research, but the basic answer is yes, sharks will kill otters, whether by accident or by design. Any others? I would just say one other thing, which is the elakha is the Chinook trading language term for sea otters. And I should have put up a slide showing where we are, but if you Google online the elakaalliance.org, you will see our website, and it is, in my humble opinion, the very best of websites. We have. Please spell it. Oh, elakha is ELAKHA, Elaka Alliance.org. And we have historical articles and science articles and so many videos that you could watch. You could just have a whole sea otter feast on our website. So please do go there and tell the story of the sea otters. The situation was as ugly and as tragic as it could possibly be as a result of human desire for this incredibly beautiful glistening pelt. But we do have a chance to make good, to bring sea otters home, to give them a chance to live in their native habitats here and elsewhere in their traditional range. And that's an enormously hopeful and beautiful thing. And that's why I'm on the board. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Glenn Kirkpatrick. I'm president of the Oregon chapter of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. And I just want to say that really enjoyed the talk tonight. That was excellent. If anybody in the audience out there liked what they saw, we would invite you to join our organization. You can go to the web, Google Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, or Lewis LCTHF, and go to their website. You'll find a lot of information about our organization. And we have meetings like this probably 4 or 5 times a year on different subjects related to Lewis and Clark and the expedition. And to say thank you, we've got a couple of checks, one for you and one for the Elaka Foundation, just to cover some of your expenses for coming up here, and some money to help bring sea otters back to Oregon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I will just say one other thing. I wrote an article talking about some of this history in the May issue. Was it the May issue? Or the May issue of the Lewis and Clark Heritage Trail Foundation journal, the We Proceeded On. And in that article, I went into a reasonably large amount of detail about sea otters' traumatic history in Oregon, and the various parties that were hunting it for the sake of the price that they could gain for the Chinese far away, who loved the sea otter for its beauty. Everybody loved the sea otter for for its beauty. It's just what we do with the love of the beauty. So those of you who are here, please come pet the sea otter skin. The sea otter pelt, it will really tell you quite a bit about why the beauty of the sea otter was so engaged.